Thanks for being here, comment why so I know you are ready, and listen to me tell the whole story. The Grand Harbor Hotel rooftop was exactly the kind of place my family loved. It was loud, expensive, and completely devoid of any real warmth. Crystal chandeliers hung from a reinforced glass canopy, catching the fading New York sunset. A jazz trio played smoothly in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for rich people making deals disguised as polite conversation. This was my brother Elijah's engagement party. 70 of the city's most elite real estate developers, politicians, and socialites were crammed onto that terrace. I sat at table 9. It was the table closest to the kitchen doors, reserved for distant cousins and people my parents felt obligated to invite but didn't want to look at. My girlfriend, Olivia, sat next to me. She looked beautiful in a simple, unbranded navy dress, her hair pulled back. She didn't have the heavy diamonds or the aggressive designer labels that every other woman in the room wore as armor. She just had this quiet, unbreakable calm about her. At the head table, my father, Robert, stood up. He tapped his knife against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clinking sound cut through the jazz music and the low hum of voices. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone wanted to hear what the CEO of Henry Real Estate Group had to say. My father smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo. He looked out over the crowd, his chest puffed out, radiating that terrifying arrogance I had known my entire life. He raised his glass toward Elijah, who was sitting next to his fiancée, wearing a smug smile. To Elijah, my father began, his voice booming across the terrace. To our successful son, our pride and joy, the man who is going to take this family's legacy into the next century. The crowd erupted in polite applause. My mother, Catherine, dabbed her dry eyes with a silk napkin, playing the part of the overwhelmed, proud matriarch perfectly. Elijah raised his own glass, soaking in the admiration like a sponge. Then my father's eyes scanned the room. I knew exactly what was coming. I felt my jaw tighten. The applause died down, and my father's gaze locked onto table 9. He found me. A cruel, familiar smirk spread across his face. He leaned slightly into the microphone. "And Mason," he said. The microphone caught the sharp edge of his tone. Heads turned toward the back of the room. I felt 70 pairs of eyes heavy with pity and judgment fall onto my shoulders. "Are you still painting those little pictures? Still in love with that poor farmer of yours?" A few suppressed chuckles rippled through the crowd. My cousin Carter actually laughed out loud. My mother didn't tell my father to stop. She just took a slow sip of her wine, looking away as if she was embarrassed by my very existence. I didn't react. I kept my eyes on my plate and carefully sliced a piece of steak. I had spent 28 years building a fortress around my emotions. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to get angry, to storm out, to prove I was the unstable disappointment they always claimed I was. I refused to give them the satisfaction. But Olivia didn't look at her plate. I felt the air shift beside me. She placed her napkin neatly on the table. She didn't look angry. She looked completely, utterly bored by my father's display of power. She stood up. The fabric of her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. At that exact moment, the most important guest in the room, Mr. Matthew Sterling, Elijah's future father-in-law and a billionaire real estate titan my father desperately needed, turned around to see who dared to stand during the toast. Matthew's eyes widened. The color completely drained from his face. He dropped his fork, and it clattered against his porcelain plate like a gunshot. He stumbled backward, knocking into the waiter behind him. "Wait," Matthew blurted out, his voice shaking, completely abandoning his polished upper-class demeanor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Olivia. "That's you." The jazz trio stopped playing. The waiters froze. The entire rooftop went dead quiet. All you could hear was the distant sound of city traffic far below. My father's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked confusion. He thought he was sitting on the throne of his kingdom. He had no idea that the woman standing next to me held the match that was about to burn it all to the ground. To understand why the next 60 seconds completely destroyed my family's 30-year empire, you have to understand the hell I lived through to get to this seat. Growing up in the Henry household wasn't about love. It was an ongoing corporate performance review, and I was failing from the moment I was born. My brother Elijah was exactly 3 years older than me, but in my father's eyes, the gap was an ocean. Elijah was the heir. He was loud, aggressive, and demanded everything in his line of sight. I was quiet. I liked to observe. I liked the smell of oil paint and the texture of raw canvas. I learned very early on that affection in our house was a currency, and I simply didn't have the funds to buy any. I remember the day it truly solidified in my mind. I was 15. Elijah was turning 18, preparing for college. My father had invited his business partners over for a massive dinner to celebrate. During dessert, my father stood up and proudly announced that he had established a massive college fund and an early inheritance trust for Elijah, setting him up to take over the commercial division of Henry Real Estate. They handed Elijah the keys to a brand new luxury car. My mother cried tears of joy. My 15th birthday was 3 weeks later. We didn't have a party. My mother said she was exhausted from planning Elijah's events. That evening, I walked into my father's home office. I had spent 3 months carving a wooden model of our family home, painting every tiny detail by hand. It was my way of trying to speak his language, trying to show him I cared about the legacy too, just in a different way. I set the model on his heavy mahogany desk. He didn't even look up from his financial reports. "What is this, Mason?" he asked, irritation clipping his words. "It's for my birthday, Dad. I made it for you. It's the house." He finally looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Wood chips and paint. You're 15 years old, Mason. Elijah was already reading market trends at your age. Take this out of here. It's leaving dust on my desk." I stood there, my hands shaking. I picked up the model. As I walked out, I bumped the doorframe, and a small piece of the wooden roof snapped off. He didn't flinch. My mother, Catherine, was always hovering just outside these moments. She was a master of toxic mediation. Later that night, she came into my room. She didn't hug me. She just sighed, sitting on the edge of my bed, careful not to wrinkle her expensive skirt. "You have to be more understanding, Mason," she said softly, but the words felt like sandpaper. "Your brother carries a very heavy burden. He has to carry this entire family. He has to be strong. Your father just wants to make sure you aren't a distraction." A distraction. That was my official title. I wasn't a son. I wasn't a brother. I was a potential liability. They poured every ounce of their resources, their praise, and their energy into Elijah. When Elijah got a C in high school math, my parents hired 3 private tutors and blamed the teacher. When I won a regional art competition, my mother threw the certificate in a drawer because it cluttered the countertops. The tilted scale of our family eventually pushed me completely out of their orbit. I realized that if I stayed, I would spend my entire life starving for a drop of water in a desert they controlled. So I stopped asking. I stopped showing them my work. I packed up my paints, put my head down, and built a wall between my heart and their expectations. When I graduated college, I didn't ask for a dime of that inheritance. I didn't want their money because their money always came with a receipt. I took a job as an art teacher at an underfunded community center in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I spent my days handing out cheap watercolors to kids who had harder lives than I could ever imagine. I showed them how to mix colors to create light in the darkness. I was making a fraction of Elijah's starting salary. My car was 12 years old and the heater barely worked. But for the first time in my life, I could breathe. I felt useful. I felt real. I thought I had safely escaped their crosshairs. I was wrong. I didn't realize that in my family, you aren't allowed to just leave. If you aren't serving the empire, you are an enemy of it. If my father was the hammer in our family, my Uncle Joseph was the poison gas. You never saw him coming until you were already choking. Joseph was my father's younger brother. He didn't have the business acumen to run the company, so my father kept him around on the board of directors out of a twisted sense of pity and control. Joseph had been through a brutal divorce a few years prior. The custody battle over his kids had drained him, leaving him bitter, hollow, and desperate to prove his worth to my father. To me, though, Uncle Joseph always played the role of the sympathetic outcast. He was the guy who would pull me aside at family Thanksgiving dinners, hand me a beer, and roll his eyes at my father's arrogant speeches. "Don't let Robert get to you, kid," Joseph would say, clapping me on the shoulder. "You've got a good heart. You're doing real work out there with those kids, not just pushing papers and stealing land like the rest of us." I fell for it. I was so starved for validation from a male figure in my family that I soaked up Joseph's fake empathy. I started confiding in him. I told him about the struggles at the community center. I told him how my meager salary barely covered rent and the extra art supplies I bought for the kids. I told him about my fears, my doubts, and my desperate hope that maybe, one day, my parents would just accept me for who I was. He listened. He nodded. He told me I was brave. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, the illusion shattered. I had gone to my father's corporate headquarters. It was something I rarely did, but the community center's roof had caved in after a storm. We needed $10,000 just to keep the doors open. I had swallowed every ounce of my pride to go there and ask my father for a charitable donation. Not for me, for the kids. The receptionist, who didn't recognize me, told me to wait outside my father's massive corner office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I raised my hand to knock, but the sound of my own name froze me in place. It was Uncle Joseph's voice. "I'm telling you, Robert, the kid is cracking," Joseph said, laughing. It was a cruel, sharp laugh I had never heard him use around me. "He was whining to me yesterday about how he can't even afford paint. His salary is a joke. He's miserable." "Good," my father's voice replied, cold and unbothered. "You need to squeeze him?" Joseph pressed on, sounding eager, desperate to please his older brother. "Don't give him a dime. Cut off his health insurance policy from the family trust. Starve him out. Give it 6 months, and he'll come crawling back here begging for a mailroom job. He's weak, Robert. You just have to break his spirit a little more." I stood in the carpeted hallway, the rain dripping from my coat onto the pristine floor. My chest tightened so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. Joseph wasn't a safe harbor. He was a spy. He was collecting my vulnerabilities and handing them to my father as ammunition, trading my pain for favor in the family hierarchy. I slowly lowered my hand. I didn't knock. I turned around and walked out of that building, stepping back out into the freezing rain. I didn't cry. The sadness had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. My uncle's betrayal forced me to see the absolute truth. I was entirely alone. There were no secret allies in my bloodline. There was no hidden reservoir of love waiting to be unlocked. They viewed my independence as an insult, and they would actively work to destroy my life just to prove a point. That night, I sat in my freezing apartment, staring at my bank account. I had $86 to my name. The community center was falling apart. My family was actively plotting my failure. I was at the absolute bottom. I had nothing left to lose. And that is exactly when you become dangerous. I stopped looking backward. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I poured every ounce of my anger and my energy into my work. I started applying for independent grants. I worked nights at a hardware store to buy supplies for the kids. I built calluses on my hands and armor over my heart. I thought I had seen the worst they had to offer. But my mother still had one final lesson to teach me about conditional love. 2 years after the incident with Uncle Joseph, something incredible happened. Despite the lack of funding, my students at the community center created a mural project that caught the attention of the mayor's office. It was a massive piece depicting the history of our city through the eyes of its working-class immigrants. Because of that mural, I was nominated for a National Urban Arts Education Award. It was a huge deal. There was going to be a formal banquet downtown. The mayor was presenting the awards. For the first time in my life, my work was being validated on a massive scale. I wanted my mother there. Even after everything, that stupid, childish part of my brain still craved her approval. I mailed a formal invitation to the house. A week later, she called me. "Mason, darling," she purred into the phone. "I got your little invite. I am so proud of you. I really am. Are you coming?" I asked, gripping the phone tight. "Of course. Your father is busy with a merger, but I wouldn't miss it. I already bought a new dress. For a month, I let myself believe it. I bought a cheap suit from a thrift store and had it tailored. I saved up to buy an extra ticket for her so she could sit at the nominee table with me. I told my students my mother was coming. I was 30 years old, and I was excited that my mom was coming to see me get a trophy. It sounds pathetic now, but it was the truth. The night of the banquet arrived. The hall was beautiful. My students were dressed in their Sunday best, buzzing with excitement. I stood by the grand entrance doors, watching the expensive cars pull up. The clock hit 7. Then 7:30. The ceremony started. I sat at my table, staring at the empty chair next to me. The heavy silence of that empty seat drowned out the music and the speeches. When they called my name to go up to the stage, I smiled for the cameras. I gave my speech. I looked out into the crowd of hundreds of cheering people, but all I saw was a void where my mother should have been. I checked my phone in the bathroom after the ceremony. No missed calls. No texts. The next morning, I drove to my parents' estate. I didn't call ahead. I walked through the front door and found my mother in the sunroom, drinking coffee and flipping through a bridal magazine. She looked up, startled. "Mason, what are you doing here?" "You didn't show up," I said. My voice was eerily calm. She sighed, putting the magazine down. She looked annoyed, not apologetic. "Oh, Mason, please don't be dramatic. I texted you." "You didn't." "Well, I meant to." She waved her hand dismissively. "Yesterday was an absolute nightmare. Elijah's fiancée, Sarah, had a total meltdown over her wedding dress fittings. She was crying hysterically. I couldn't just leave the poor girl. You understand. A wedding is a major family milestone. Your little art thing. Well, there will be other banquets." I stared at her. She wasn't lying to cover up. She genuinely believed that shopping for a wedding dress for the woman marrying her golden child was vastly more important than witnessing the greatest achievement of my life. She looked at me as if my being upset was an inconvenience to her morning coffee. She looked at my award ceremony like it was a funeral she had successfully avoided attending. "A major family milestone," I repeated softly. "Exactly," she smiled, thinking I had backed down. "I'll take you to lunch next week to make up for it. We can go to that sandwich place you like." I realized then that Catherine wasn't a victim of my father's dominance. She was an active participant in my erasure. She used the illusion of maternal love to keep me tethered, but she would cut the rope the second Elijah needed anything. "Don't worry about lunch, Mom," I said. I turned around and walked toward the door. "Mason, don't walk away when I'm speaking to you. You are being entirely too sensitive," she called out, her voice finally rising. I didn't stop. I walked out to my beat-up car, tossed the glass award onto the passenger seat, and drove away. I didn't know it yet, but closing that door behind me was the universe clearing the path. Because the very next week, I met the woman who would show me what real value looked like. I needed to get the kids out of the city. The community center was suffocating in the summer heat, so I organized a field trip. I found a listing online for a massive, independent ecological reserve about 2 hours upstate. They offered free educational tours for inner-city youth programs. We drove up in a rented yellow school bus. The moment we passed the iron gates of the reserve, the concrete jungle vanished. Rolling green hills, massive automated greenhouses, and acres of restored forests stretched out as far as the eye could see. The kids pressed their faces against the glass in awe. We parked near a large, rustic barn that served as an educational hub. A woman walked out to meet us. This was Olivia. She wasn't wearing a blazer or holding a clipboard. She was wearing faded denim overalls, heavy rubber work boots caked in fresh mud, and a worn-out flannel shirt rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was tied back in a messy braid, and she had a smudge of dirt across her left cheek. She held a heavy wooden crate of seedlings against her hip like it weighed nothing. "You must be Mason," she said, setting the crate down and wiping her hand on her jeans before shaking mine. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and incredibly warm. "I'm Olivia. I manage the grounds." For the next 4 hours, I watched this woman captivate 30 chaotic teenagers. She didn't talk down to them. She handed them shovels. She let them get their hands deep into the dark, rich soil. She taught them how a dying ecosystem could be brought back to life if you just paid attention to what the roots needed. I was mesmerized. In my world, women dressed to intimidate. My mother and the women my brother dated wore their wealth like armor, constantly calculating the net worth of everyone in the room. Olivia didn't care about any of that. She was grounded. She was real. During the lunch break, while the kids ate sandwiches on the grass, I walked over to where she was repairing a drip irrigation line. I handed her a bottle of water. "You're good with them," I said, sitting on an overturned bucket. "They're good kids," she replied, taking a drink and wiping her forehead with the back of her arm. "They just need to know that growth takes time. People in the city expect everything instantly. Out here, you have to be patient. You have to nurture things." We started talking. Really talking. I didn't tell her about my father's empire or my brother's luxury cars. I told her about my art. I told her about how hard it was to keep the center funded. I told her about the exhaustion of trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see me. She listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. She just looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Value isn't something someone else assigns to you, Mason. It's what you build with your own 2 hands." I felt something shift inside my chest. A heavy, frozen block of resentment that I had carried for decades began to crack. I started driving up to the reserve on weekends. I told her I wanted to volunteer, to help her with the planting. But really, I just wanted to be near her. We spent hours working side by side in silence. We ate cheap diner food on the tailgate of her dusty pickup truck. We fell in love slowly, naturally, like a quiet sunrise. She told me she lived in a small cabin on the edge of the property. She told me she loved the quiet life. I loved her for it. I loved that she didn't care about high society. I loved that she was exactly who she appeared to be. A hard-working, brilliant woman whose hands were calloused from real labor. I was happy. Truly, deeply happy for the first time in my adult life. But my family had a radar for my happiness, and they couldn't stand it. While I was building a new life with Olivia, my past was preparing to launch a devastating attack. And the weapon they used wasn't a family member. It was my best friend. John was the manager of the community center. We had worked side by side for 5 years. We painted walls together, chased down truants together, and split cheap pizzas when our paychecks were late. I considered him a brother, the brother Elijah never was. But I forgot a fundamental rule of the world I came from. Everyone has a price. The community center sat on a prime piece of corner real estate in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying. We didn't own the building. We leased it from an old private trust. For months, John and I had been working on a massive grant proposal to buy the building outright so the kids would never lose their safe haven. I had poured hundreds of hours into drafting the legal framework and the artistic vision for the space. One Thursday afternoon, I walked into the center. The lights were mostly off. The kids hadn't arrived yet. I saw John standing by the front desk. Next to him was a man in a sharp, $1,000 suit holding a leather briefcase. A corporate lawyer. My stomach dropped. I knew that suit. I knew the aggressive posture. That lawyer worked for Henry Real Estate Group. He worked for my brother, Elijah. "John? What's going on?" I asked, walking forward. John wouldn't look me in the eye. He shuffled his feet, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The lawyer smiled. A predatory, terrifyingly polite smile. "Mason," the lawyer said smoothly, "we're just finalizing some paperwork. Elijah sends his regards." "Paperwork for what?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty hall. The lawyer handed me a crisp, white envelope. Notice of eviction. Henry Real Estate Group officially purchased this building and the surrounding block this morning. We are tearing it down to build luxury condos. You have 30 days to vacate. The words hit me like a physical blow. Couldn't breathe. I looked at John. His face was pale, sweating. John, I whispered, stepping toward him. How did they know? How did they know the trust was willing to sell? We were the only ones who had the contact information. We were submitting our grant tomorrow. John finally looked up. His eyes were defensive, hard. Look, Mason, be reasonable. We were never going to get that grant. We're bleeding money. Your brother, he reached out to me. He offered me a way out. A way out. I yelled, the anger finally bursting through my chest. You sold us out? For what? A promotion. John spat back, his voice rising to match mine. He offered me a director-level position at Henry Group's philanthropic wing. 6 figures, Mason. Benefits. A real office. I can't eat noble intentions. I have a mortgage. I felt the blood rushing in my ears. Elijah didn't even want this neighborhood. It wasn't his usual demographic. He bought this building for one reason and one reason only, to destroy the only thing I had built, to force me to my knees. And he used my best friend to hold the knife. You didn't just sell out a building, John, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, shaking whisper. You sold out 300 kids who trusted you. They're your family, Mason. John deflected, grabbing his jacket. Take it up with them. I'm done playing savior. He walked out the door with the lawyer. I stood alone in the dark hallway of the center. I looked at the murals on the wall, the messy art supplies, the worn-out chairs. Everything I had fought for was gone, snatched away by a stroke of my brother's pen and the greed of a friend. I drove to the estate that night. I didn't cry. I was shaking with a rage so deep it felt cold. When I parked my truck outside Olivia's cabin, she came out onto the porch. She saw my face and immediately knew. She pulled me inside. She didn't ask questions. She just held me while I finally broke down. I told her everything. I told her how Elijah had bought the building. I told her about John's betrayal. I told her how my family would never, ever stop punishing me for refusing to bow to them. I have nothing, I whispered, burying my face in my hands. I'm 28 years old, and they just wiped me out. Olivia knelt in front of me. She took my hands, my shaking, paint-stained hands, and held them tightly in hers. Her eyes were completely clear, completely devoid of fear. They didn't wipe you out, Mason, she said softly, but with a terrifying intensity. They just made the biggest mistake of their pathetic lives. I didn't understand what she meant then. I just thought she was trying to comfort me. I had no idea that beneath the flannel shirt and the dirt on her boots, the woman holding my hands possessed enough power to crush my father's empire into dust. Next week is Elijah's engagement dinner, I said, my voice hoarse. My parents want me there to parade their victory. They want me to show up broken. Olivia stood up, her jaw set into a hard, unyielding line. We're going, she said. Olivia, no. You don't know these people. They will tear you apart just to get to me. She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching a trap spring shut. Let them try, Mason. I think it's time I formally met your family. I should have known better than to bring Olivia to the family dinner leading up to the engagement party. It was a private affair at my parents' estate. Just the immediate family. A warm-up round for the main event. My mother insisted I bring my little friend so she could evaluate her. I tried to tell Olivia we could skip it, but she was adamant. We arrived at the mansion on Friday night. Olivia didn't dress up. She wore clean dark jeans, a plain white sweater, and a pair of leather boots that had clearly seen miles of dirt roads. Beside the marble pillars and the European sports cars in my father's driveway, she looked like an alien. We walked into the formal dining room. The heavy oak table was set with silver and fine china. My father, Robert, sat at the head. My mother, Catherine, sat to his right, wearing a silk blouse that cost more than my car. Elijah and his fiancée, Sarah, were lounging on the velvet chairs, drinking imported wine. Carter, my obnoxious cousin who basically lived at the house, was already laughing at something Elijah said. The laughter stopped the second we walked in. 5 pairs of eyes snapped to Olivia. I watched them perform a visual autopsy on her. They took in her unstyled hair, her lack of jewelry, the sensible boots. I could practically hear the cash registers in their heads ringing up a total of $0. Well, my mother broke the silence, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. You must be Olivia. Mason has told us absolutely nothing about you. Good evening, Mrs. Henry, Olivia said politely. Taking the seat I pulled out for her at the far end of the table. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They didn't insult her directly. They used the passive-aggressive scalpel that wealthy people perfect over decades. So, Olivia, Elijah started, swirling his wine glass. Mason says you work out at that nature reserve. What exactly do you do? Rake leaves? Give tours to toddlers? Carter snickered. I manage the grounds and oversee the operational health of the estate, Olivia answered calmly, slicing her chicken. Her voice didn't waver. Operational health? My father scoffed, not even looking at her. Sounds like a fancy way of saying you're a farmer. It's manual labor. Noble, I suppose, for people who don't have the capacity for high-level strategy. My jaw clenched. Dad, don't. Don't what, Mason? My father snapped, his eyes flashing toward me. I'm making conversation. We are simply trying to understand how someone with her background expects to build a future. Unless, of course, the plan is to simply attach herself to someone whose last name is Henry. The implication was clear. They thought she was a gold digger, which was hilarious, considering my bank account was currently overdrawn by $14 thanks to Elijah getting me evicted. I can assure you, Mr. Henry, Olivia said, setting her knife down. She looked directly down the length of the table into my father's eyes. My future is incredibly secure. I don't need anyone's last name to build my legacy. My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Oh, honey, that is very cute. But idealism doesn't pay a mortgage. Catherine signaled the maid to clear the plates. While the staff moved around us, my mother reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and slid it across the polished wood table toward Olivia. We know Mason is struggling, Catherine said, her voice lowering into a fake, conspiratorial whisper, as if she were doing us a favor. He lost his little job this week. We are fully aware of the financial reality. I assume you don't have the means to support him either. This envelope has $10,000 in cash. The room went dead silent. Even Elijah looked slightly surprised by how blunt my mother was being. Mom, I growled, standing up. Are you insane? Put that away. Sit down, Mason, my father barked. My mother ignored me, keeping her eyes locked on Olivia. Take the money, Olivia. Go buy yourself a nice wardrobe. Maybe start a little flower shop. But I want you to understand that Mason is a sinking ship. If you stay with him, you will drown. Take the envelope, and leave our son to figure out his own mess. It was the ultimate insult. She was trying to buy off my girlfriend right in front of me. I felt the veins in my neck throbbing. I was about to flip the heavy dining table over. But Olivia placed her hand on my arm. A gentle, firm pressure. Stand down. She didn't look angry. She looked at my mother with a mixture of amusement and deep, profound pity. Olivia picked up the envelope. She felt the weight of the cash inside. Then, she tossed it casually back across the table. It slid and stopped perfectly in front of my mother's plate. Mrs. Henry, Olivia said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. Keep your money. You're going to need every single penny of it very soon. My parents froze. Carter stopped chewing. They didn't know how to process a threat delivered with a smile from someone they considered a peasant. What is that supposed to mean? my father demanded, his face turning red. It means, Olivia said, standing up and smoothing her sweater. That dinner was lovely, but we have to leave. We will see you all at the engagement party on Saturday. She took my hand, and we walked out of the dining room. Nobody stopped us. Behind us, I heard my father yelling for the maid to take the money away, furious that his display of power had been swatted away like a mosquito. As we drove back in the dark, my hands were still gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. You shouldn't have done that, I told her. They are vindictive, Olivia. Elijah will make it his mission to ruin you now. Olivia stared out the window into the night. Mason, your brother is playing checkers on a board he doesn't own. Let him try. The fallout from that dinner didn't take long. 2 days before the massive engagement party at the Grand Harbor Hotel, my phone rang. It was Elijah's private secretary, demanding I come to his office at the corporate headquarters immediately. I didn't want to go, but I knew ignoring him would only make the situation at the party worse. I wanted to protect Olivia from whatever ambush they were planning. I walked into the Henry Real Estate Group building. The glass walls, the marble floors, the men in sharp suits rushing past. It all felt like a machine designed to crush anything soft or human. I took the private elevator to the top floor. Elijah's office was absurdly large. He had floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the Manhattan skyline. He was sitting behind a glass desk, aggressively tapping a silver pen against a thick legal folder. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Close the door," he ordered. I shut the heavy oak door. "What do you want, Elijah? Haven't you done enough? You took the community center. You won." He finally looked at me. There was no triumph in his eyes. There was stress. Deep, dark bags under his eyes that his expensive concealer couldn't hide. He looked like a man standing on a landmine, terrified to move a muscle. The center was business, Mason. "Grow up," he snapped. He threw the pen down. "I called you here to give you a warning about Saturday night. I told Mom we're coming. We aren't going to cause a scene if that's what you're worried about." "I am worried about you breathing the wrong way, Mason," Elijah said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "This engagement party isn't just a party. It is the most important business merger this family has ever attempted. Matthew Sterling, Sarah's father, is the keynote guest." I knew who Matthew Sterling was. Everyone in New York knew. He was a ruthless billionaire, a self-made titan who controlled a massive chunk of the city's commercial zoning. "Matthew is traditional," Elijah continued, his voice tight with anxiety. "He cares about family optics. He cares about perfection. If he sees you and that dirt-kicking girlfriend of yours causing drama, it reflects poorly on me. And if it reflects poorly on me, the deal falls through." I crossed my arms. "What deal, Elijah? You guys have more money than God. Why are you sweating so hard?" Elijah hesitated. For a split second, the arrogant facade slipped, and I saw genuine panic. He rubbed his temples. "We need Matthew. Dad over-leveraged the company on a massive commercial development down in the harbor. We are bleeding cash, but there is a massive parcel of untouched land upstate. It's owned by a private conglomerate called the Eco Trust. If we can buy that land, the harbor development is saved. It's a billion-dollar pivot." I frowned. "And what does Matthew have to do with it?" "Matthew knows the CEO of the Eco Trust," Elijah explained, pacing behind his desk. "The CEO is notoriously private. Nobody knows their face, nobody has their direct number. They only deal through intermediaries. Dad has been begging Matthew for 2 years to set up a meeting. If the wedding goes smoothly, Matthew promised to broker the introduction next week." I stared at my brother. The great Henry Empire was a house of cards. Behind the custom suits and the arrogance, they were drowning in debt, begging another billionaire for a lifeline. "So," I said slowly, "you evicted my students and destroyed my life to make yourself feel big. While behind closed doors, you're begging for scraps?" Elijah's face flushed purple. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Listen to me, you pathetic loser. You will show up on Saturday. You will sit at the back table. You will keep your mouth shut, and you will make sure that farm girl doesn't embarrass us in front of Matthew Sterling. If you ruin this for me, I swear to God, Mason, I will make sure you can't get a job sweeping streets in this city. Do we understand each other? I looked at his shaking finger. I felt absolutely nothing. No fear. No intimidation. Just a profound realization of how small he truly was. I understand perfectly, Elijah, I said. I turned and walked toward the door. Back table, Mason, he yelled after me. Keep her out of sight. I walked out of the building. The air outside felt cleaner. I took out my phone and called Olivia. She picked up on the first ring. Hey, I said. Elijah just gave me the rundown for Saturday. He's terrified we're going to embarrass him in front of his future father-in-law. Apparently, Dad desperately needs an introduction to some company called the Eco Trust. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched out for so long I thought the call had dropped. Olivia? You there? When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, but it carried a weight that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I'm here, Mason, she said. Tell Elijah not to worry. Promise, Matthew Sterling and I are going to get along just fine. Saturday evening arrived. The sky over Manhattan was a bruised purple as we pulled up to the Grand Harbor Hotel. The valet took the keys to my beat-up car, looking at it like it was a disease among the line of Bentleys and Maybachs. I looked at Olivia as we stood outside the revolving doors. She had transformed, but not in the way my mother would have wanted. She wasn't dripping in diamonds. She wore a tailored, midnight blue dress that hit just below the knee. It was devoid of any logos, completely understated, yet the way it was cut screamed absolute, untouchable elegance. Her hair was swept up, and she wore a single, delicate silver necklace. She didn't look like she was trying to fit in. She looked like she owned the building. You ready for this? I asked, offering her my arm. I've been ready for this all week, she smiled, slipping her arm through mine. We took the gold-plated elevator up to the rooftop terrace. The doors opened to a wall of sound and light. Waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and caviar. The 70 guests were a sea of designer tuxedos and expensive gowns. The moment we stepped off the elevator, the invisible tripwires of my family's social radar went off. My cousin Carter was the first to approach. He was holding a drink, his face already flushed. Well, Carter smirked, looking Olivia up and down. Look who cleaned up. Did Aunt Catherine's envelope buy that dress? Or did you rent it? I stepped forward, my chest tightening, but Olivia gently squeezed my arm. She didn't even look at Carter. She looked right through him, treating him with the kind of dismissive silence you reserve for an annoying gnat. Carter's smirk faltered under her absolute lack of reaction, and he awkwardly slinked away back into the crowd. We found our seats at table 9, tucked away near the service doors exactly as Elijah had ordered. I watched the room. It was fascinating to see the power dynamics play out in real time. My father was working the room like a desperate politician, shaking hands, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. My mother was hovering near Sarah, the bride-to-be, adjusting the girl's veil and playing the devoted mother-in-law. Then the atmosphere in the room physically shifted. The elevator doors opened, and a hush fell over the crowd near the entrance. Mr. Matthew Sterling had arrived. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. He didn't smile as he walked in. He moved with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who could destroy a company with a phone call. My father practically shoved 2 guests out of the way to get to him. Matthew, my friend. Thank you so much for coming. Robert was bowing his head slightly, his posture completely submissive. It was sickening to watch the man who had terrorized me my entire life grovel like a dog. Matthew shook my father's hand briefly. Robert, beautiful venue. Sarah looks lovely. Yes, Elijah is a lucky man. My father beamed, gesturing toward the head table. Please, right this way to the VIP section. Matthew began walking through the crowd, led by my father. Their path took them directly past table 9. I tensed up, expecting my father to throw a glare my way to ensure I stayed quiet. But Robert didn't even look at me. He was too focused on Matthew. As Matthew walked past our table, he happened to glance down. I saw it happen in slow motion. Matthew's eyes swept over me and landed on Olivia. For a fraction of a second, the billionaire's confident stride completely broke. He physically stumbled, his expensive leather shoe catching on the carpet. His eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to speak. But before he could utter a word, my father enthusiastically grabbed Matthew's shoulder, steering him away. "And wait until you taste the catering, Matthew. We flew the chef in from Paris." Matthew was dragged toward the front of the room, but he kept looking over his shoulder, back at our table. He looked confused. He looked terrified. I turned to Olivia. She was calmly sipping her sparkling water, watching Matthew take his seat at the head table. A tiny, razor-sharp smile played at the corner of her lips. "Olivia," I whispered, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "Why did Matthew Sterling just look at you like he saw a ghost?" She set her glass down. The jazz music swelled as the waiters began pouring the champagne for the toasts. "Because Mason," she said softly, her eyes locking onto my father at the front of the room. "He knows exactly who I am. And in about 5 minutes, your father is going to find out too." The glass in my father's hand tapped against the microphone. The room fell silent. The storm was here. The sharp ringing of my father's knife against his crystal champagne glass echoed across the rooftop terrace. The jazz band immediately stopped playing. The low hum of wealthy people discussing their investment portfolios and summer homes fell completely silent. Everyone turned their attention to the head of the table. My father, Robert Henry, stood tall, his custom tuxedo perfectly pressed. His chest puffed out with the kind of aggressive pride that only comes from thinking you own the world. He looked out over the 70 guests. He looked at the city skyline behind us. Then he looked at his golden child. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father began, his voice booming through the microphone, engineered to command respect. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the future, to celebrate my son, Elijah, and his beautiful bride-to-be, Sarah. Elijah has been the cornerstone of Henry Real Estate Group. He has just secured a massive promotion to executive vice president. He is a man of vision, a man of relentless drive, and the sole reason our family's legacy will dominate this city for the next 50 years. The crowd erupted into applause. People raised their glasses. Elijah sat there soaking it in, a smug, satisfied smile plastered across his face. My mother, Catherine, wiped a fake tear from her eye, playing the role of the devoted matriarch to absolute perfection. My father raised his hand, signaling for quiet. The applause died down. He wasn't finished. He needed a punchline. He needed a contrast to make Elijah shine even brighter. And in our family, I was always the contrast. His eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the billionaires and the politicians, until they locked onto table 9. My table, the table shoved near the kitchen doors. A cruel, familiar smirk spread across my father's face. He leaned closer to the microphone. "And then, of course, there is my other son, Mason," my father said. The microphone picked up the sharp, mocking edge in his tone. 70 pairs of eyes whipped around to look at me. I felt the collective weight of their pity and judgment pressing down on my shoulders. "Tell me, Mason," my father continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you still playing with your little paints? Still dragging down the family name? And what about that poor farmer you brought with you tonight? Is she going to grow some carrots to pay your rent now that you don't have a job?" A ripple of cruel laughter washed through the crowd. My cousin Carter snorted into his drink. Elijah grinned. My mother didn't say a word to stop him. She simply took a slow sip of her expensive wine and looked away. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to yell, to storm out, to prove I was the unstable, overly sensitive disappointment they always claimed I was. I felt my jaw lock. My hands clenched into fists under the table. I was 28 years old, But in that moment, I felt like that 15-year-old kid holding a broken wooden house. But Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't look down at her plate. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked completely, utterly bored by my father's pathetic display of dominance. She calmly placed her linen napkin on the table. She stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the marble floor cut through the lingering laughter like a knife. At that exact second, Mr. Matthew Sterling, the billionaire titan my father was desperately trying to impress, the man whose approval the entire Henry Empire depended on, turned around in his seat at the VIP table to see who had the nerve to stand up during the toast. Matthew's eyes locked onto Olivia. The blood completely drained from Matthew's face. He looked like he had just been struck by lightning. He dropped his heavy silver fork. It hit his porcelain plate with a loud, sharp crack that echoed across the dead-silent terrace. Matthew stumbled backward, his chair tipping over and crashing to the floor. "Wait," Matthew blurted out, his voice shaking, completely losing his polished, high-society composure. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my girlfriend. "Wait, that's you." My father's smirk vanished instantly. He lowered the microphone, looking back and forth between Matthew and Olivia in sheer, panicked confusion. Matthew didn't look at my father. He practically sprinted across the rooftop terrace, shoving past a waiter holding a tray of champagne. He stopped 2 feet in front of our table. This terrifying, powerful billionaire suddenly bowed his head, his posture completely submissive. "Ms. Olivia," Matthew stammered, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My God, I had no idea you were in New York. I had no idea you would be attending this event. Please, forgive the seating arrangement. This is completely unacceptable." The rooftop went so quiet you could hear the wind blowing off the harbor. My father gripped the edge of the head table, his knuckles turning white. "Matthew," my father called out, his voice cracking with forced nervous laughter. "Matthew, what are you doing? That is Mason's girlfriend. She works at a community garden upstate." Matthew slowly turned around to face my father. The look of absolute disgust on Matthew's face was something I will never forget. "A community garden?" Matthew repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy growl. He marched back toward the head table, closing the distance between him and my father. "Are you completely out of your mind, Robert? Are you really this arrogant? Or just this stupid?" "I don't understand," my father stammered, taking a step back. "That woman," Matthew pointed back at Olivia, "is the founder and chief executive officer of the Eco Trust, the same Eco Trust that owns the 3,000 acres of commercial development land you have been begging me to help you buy for the last 2 years. She is the sole decision-maker for a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. You have been calling my office every single day, practically in tears, begging for a 5-minute phone call with her to save your drowning company." The collective gasp from the 70 guests sucked the oxygen out of the room. My mother dropped her wine glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine bleeding into the white carpet. Elijah looked like he was going to vomit. Matthew wasn't done. He stepped right up to my father's face. "You invited me here tonight to convince me to broker a deal," Matthew sneered. "And then you stand up in front of this entire room and humiliate the very woman holding the financial rope you are hanging from. You called her a poor farmer. You insulted her partner. You are a clown, Robert. A pathetic, small-minded clown." My father's face turned an ashen gray. He looked at Olivia, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The realization of what he had just done hit him with the force of a freight train. He had just publicly executed his own legacy. Olivia walked out from behind our table. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She stopped in the middle of the room, looking up at the head table. "Mr. Henry," Olivia said, her voice smooth, calm, and carrying a lethal authority. "For 18 months, I have watched how you treat your son. I watched you belittle his art. I watched you mock his salary. I watched you actively try to destroy his life because he refused to worship your bank account. You judge the value of human beings by the price tags on their clothes. She paused, letting the silence suffocate my parents. I came here tonight to see if there was any redeeming quality left in this family, Olivia continued. There isn't. You will never get that meeting, Robert. You will never get that land. The Eco Trust will never do business with Henry Real Estate. Consider your harbor project dead. My father collapsed into his chair. He looked physically destroyed. My mother was openly weeping, her hands covering her face. Elijah was staring at the table, completely paralyzed. I walked up to stand next to Olivia. I looked at the three of them, the people who had made my entire life a miserable, exhausting test I could never pass. They looked so incredibly small. You spent my whole life telling me I was worthless, I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. You thought money gave you the right to treat people like garbage. You blew Elijah's college fund on bad investments, you hid your debts, and you used me as a punching bag to make yourselves feel powerful. I looked my father right in the eyes. I'm not angry anymore, I told him. I'm just done. I don't want your money. I don't want your name. And I never want to see any of you again. I took Olivia's hand. We turned around and walked toward the elevator. Nobody said a word. Nobody tried to stop us. The only sound was the clicking of Olivia's heels against the marble floor. We stepped into the elevator. The brass doors slid shut, and we left my family sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance. The silence in the elevator on the way down to the lobby was the best sound I had ever heard in my life. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of my childhood home. It was clean. It was the sound of a chain finally snapping. We walked out of the hotel, got into my beat-up car, and drove away. We didn't celebrate. We just rolled the windows down and breathed in the night air. For the first time in 28 years, I felt entirely, wonderfully free. But the universe wasn't done balancing the scales. The fallout from that night at the Grand Harbor Hotel was swift, brutal, and absolute. 3 days later, I was sitting on the porch of Olivia's cabin, drinking coffee and watching the morning fog roll over the trees. My phone started buzzing on the wooden table. I looked at the screen. It was Elijah. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started buzzing again. I picked it up. Mason! Elijah's voice cracked the second I answered. He wasn't yelling. He was sobbing. He sounded like a terrified child. Mason, please. You have to talk to her. You have to fix this. I don't have to do anything, Elijah, I said calmly, taking a sip of my coffee. What happened? He practically choked on his words. Matthew pulled out. He canceled everything. Sarah called off the wedding this morning. She moved out. Matthew told his entire network what Dad did at the party. He told them Dad is unstable and financially toxic. All our investors are running. The banks called in the loans for the harbor project. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity, but I remembered the eviction notice he handed me with a smile. I remembered my students crying when the community center doors were locked. Actions have consequences, Elijah, I said. You guys built a house out of arrogance. A strong wind was always going to knock it down. It's worse than that, Elijah whispered, panic fully taking over his voice. Dad ordered a full emergency audit to try and scrape together enough liquid cash to pay off the bank. The auditors, they found my accounts. I sat up a little straighter. What accounts? Elijah broke down completely. Through the tears and the hyperventilating, the truth finally spilled out. The golden child, the brilliant executive vice president, was a complete fraud. For the last 3 years, Elijah had been secretly embezzling millions of dollars from the company's operational funds. He had taken massive, reckless gambles on offshore cryptocurrency schemes that completely tanked. He was drowning in personal debt from high-stakes gambling and luxury car leases he couldn't afford. I tried to fix it, Elijah cried. I thought if I bought the land your community center was on, I could flip it to a commercial developer quickly and cover my tracks before the audit. That's why I evicted you, Mason. I needed the cash immediately. I was desperate. He hadn't targeted my center just out of spite. He targeted it because he was a desperate criminal trying to hide his own incompetence. The great, untouchable Elijah was nothing but a thief in $1,000 suit. What did Dad do? I asked, my voice completely flat. He lost his mind, Elijah sobbed. He threw a glass at the wall. He fired me on the spot. He's talking to a lawyer right now to see if he can avoid going to prison for my financial mismanagement. Mason, please. If Olivia just signs the land deal for the Eco Trust, the banks will back off. I'll go to rehab. I'll do whatever you want. Please save us. You don't get it, Elijah, I said. There is no us. You burned that bridge a long time ago. Call a lawyer. I hung up the phone and blocked his number. Over the next month, I watched the Henry Real Estate Group collapse from a distance. It was on the local news. Without Matthew Sterling's backing and the Eco Trust land deal, the harbor project defaulted. The banks seized my father's corporate headquarters. The company was forced to file for bankruptcy protection. My Uncle Joseph, the man who had played both sides and fed my father information to ruin me, lost his cushy board seat and his salary. He tried to sue my father for severance, which only dragged the family name further through the mud in a messy, public legal battle. It was like watching a group of sharks turn on each other the second the water got warm. My mother, Catherine, suffered perhaps the most painful defeat of all for a woman in her position. Her social standing evaporated overnight. The wealthy elite of New York do not tolerate public embarrassment or financial failure. She was quietly removed from the boards of her charity organizations. Her invitations to galas stopped coming. The country club suspended their membership due to unpaid dues. She had spent her entire life judging people by their wealth, and now she had to wake up every morning and look in the mirror at a woman who had absolutely nothing left but a ruined reputation. It felt like a funeral for a family I never really had. I didn't rejoice in their pain, but I didn't mourn them either. I was too busy building my own life. 6 months passed. The winter thawed into a bright, vibrant spring. Without the crushing weight of my family's judgment, my life flourished in ways I never thought possible. With Olivia's guidance, I applied for federal grants using a new nonprofit structure. We didn't just get the funding. We received a massive endowment from an independent arts foundation. I opened a brand new, state-of-the-art community center on the other side of the city. We had real studios, top-tier supplies, and enough space to help double the number of kids. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the main studio, helping a group of teenagers mix acrylics for a mural, when the receptionist walked in. She looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Mason," she said hesitantly, "there are 2 people in the lobby asking for you. They say they're your parents." I put my paintbrush down. I wiped my hands on a rag, took a deep breath, and walked out to the front. My father and mother were standing near the entrance, looking completely out of place among the bright finger paintings and the worn couches. They looked like they had aged 10 years in 6 months. My father was wearing a suit, but it wasn't custom-tailored anymore. It looked slightly too big for him, hanging off his shoulders. His hair was thinner, his posture defeated. My mother looked small. She wasn't wearing any heavy jewelry, and she kept her eyes glued to the floor. I stopped 10 feet away from them. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't smile. I just waited. My father cleared his throat. He tried to muster up that old, booming CEO voice, but it came out raspy and weak. "Hello, Mason," he said. "What are you doing here, Robert?" I asked. I didn't call him Dad. My mother flinched at the sound of his first name. She finally looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mason, please, don't be like this. We're your family. We've been through hell. Elijah is facing fraud charges. We had to sell the estate just to pay the legal fees. We're living in a condo in Queens." "I read the news," I said, my voice completely void of emotion. "What do you want?" My father stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "We want to apologize, Mason. We were wrong. We pushed you too hard. We didn't understand your path. But we're here now. We want to make things right. We want to be a family again." He paused, licking his dry lips. "And We know you have influence with Olivia. The Eco Trust is expanding. They are looking for commercial project managers. I have 30 years of experience. Mason, if you could just put in a good word, just get me an interview with her. We could start over. I stared at him. It was almost funny. Even now, standing in the ashes of his own life, he couldn't see past his own greed. You aren't apologizing to your son, I said, my voice sharp and clear. You are apologizing to my connections. You are mourning your bank account, not your family. You don't miss me. You miss the power you thought you had over me. That's not true, my mother cried out, stepping forward. We love you, Mason. You are all we have left. You had me for 28 years. I fired back, the raw honesty finally pouring out. And you spent every single one of those years making sure I knew I was a disappointment. You missed my awards. You mocked my salary. You tried to bribe my girlfriend to leave me. You sat by while Elijah stole the building right out from under my kids. You didn't love me when you had millions, and you don't love me now that you're broke. You just need a life raft. My father looked at the floor. He knew I was right. That is my final offer, I interrupted, stepping back and pointing toward the glass doors. Leave my center. Now. They looked at my face. They saw the cold, unbreakable resolve in my eyes. The old Mason, the boy who craved their approval, was dead. They turned around and walked out into the busy city street, disappearing into the crowd. I watched them go, and I felt nothing but peace. That weekend, I drove upstate to Olivia's property. I thought I knew everything about her, but she still had surprises left. We were walking past the main greenhouses when she led me down a gravel path toward a massive, restored timber barn tucked behind a hill. I had never been inside it. She pulled a heavy set of keys from her pocket and unlocked the sliding wooden doors. She pushed them open, and the late afternoon sun flooded the interior. I stopped dead in my tracks. My jaw literally dropped. The barn was immaculate. The floor was polished concrete. And sitting perfectly spaced out in the massive room was a collection of cars that would make any billionaire weep. There was a pristine, silver 1964 Aston Martin DB5, a flawless, cherry-red classic Ferrari 250 GTO, and in the corner, a breathtaking vintage Porsche 911 sitting on blocks, half disassembled. I slowly walked inside, running my hand over the gleaming fender of the Ferrari. I looked back at Olivia, completely stunned. You own these? I stammered. She laughed, a bright, beautiful sound. She walked over to the Porsche and picked up a wrench from a nearby toolbox. I don't just own them, Mason. She smiled, her eyes sparkling. I restore them. It's my hobby. When I need to clear my head from running the trust, I come out here and get my hands dirty. I told you, I like fixing broken things. I stood there, looking at this incredible woman in her flannel shirt and boots, standing next to millions of dollars worth of classic cars she fixed with her own two hands. My family had spent their entire lives trying to project an image of wealth with leased luxury SUVs and flashy watches they couldn't afford. They were loud, hollow, and desperately insecure. Olivia was the definition of quiet luxury. She possessed real power, real wealth, and real talent, and she felt absolutely zero need to prove it to anyone. I walked over to her, took the wrench out of her hand, and pulled her into a kiss. I'm 30 years old now. It's been 2 years since that night on the rooftop terrace, 2 years since I walked away from the Henry Real Estate Group and everything attached to it. I was at the community center yesterday afternoon. One of my students, a quiet kid named Luke who reminds me a lot of myself at that age, ran up to me. He had spent 3 weeks working on a canvas. He proudly handed it to me. It was a painting of a massive, sprawling oak tree with deep, vibrant roots digging into the earth. At the bottom, in messy handwriting, he had written, "For Mr. Mason and Miss Olivia." I hung it right in the center of my office wall. It is the most valuable piece of art I own. People ask me sometimes if I regret walking away. They ask if I miss the safety net of coming from a wealthy family, or if I ever feel guilty for cutting my parents out of my life. My answer is always the same: no. Not even for a single second. Going through that fire taught me the most important lesson of my life. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just a biological lottery ticket. Family is about respect. It's about who stands beside you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your genuine self. Family is the people who nurture your roots, not the people who constantly threaten to cut down your branches just to build their own thrones. My father and brother spent their entire lives chasing a definition of success that was entirely based on making other people feel small. They measured their worth by the price tag on their suits and the fear in their employees' eyes. And in the end, that relentless, arrogant pursuit left them with absolutely nothing. No empire, no legacy, no family, just a pile of debt and a hollow reputation. I used to think that the best revenge would be to stand over them and watch them suffer. I used to fantasize about screaming in their faces and making them feel the pain they caused me. But I realized that true revenge doesn't look like anger. True revenge looks like absolute, unbothered happiness. Revenge is waking up on a Sunday morning, making coffee in the kitchen of the eco estate, and watching Olivia laugh as she wrestles with our 2 rescue dogs in the yard. Revenge is looking at the bank account for my community center and seeing it fully funded, knowing we are actually changing kids' lives. Revenge is looking in the mirror and knowing that every single thing I have, I built with my own hands and my own integrity. They wanted me to be a failure, and the greatest insult I could ever give them was to build a beautiful, peaceful life where their opinions, their money, and their existence simply do not matter anymore. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long one, but it felt good to finally get it all out there. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Whether you're dealing with a toxic workplace, fake friends, or a family that just refuses to see your true value, I hope you know that you don't have to stay in a room where you are constantly disrespected. You have the power to walk out that door and build your own table. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from people you thought you couldn't live without, only to realize it was the best decision you ever made? I want to read your stories. Drop them down in the comments below. And finally, if you made it all the way to this exact second of the video, I want you to go down to the comments and just type the letter W. That stands for winner. It's our little secret code. It lets me know that you are part of the 1% Club, the group of amazing, dedicated people who stick around until the very end. When I see that W, I know exactly who the real ones are. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed the story, and make sure you follow the channel so we can hang out again. I've got a lot more stories to share with you all. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.